Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another States Trust podcast. My name is Chris Myers, Director of Federal Affairs at States Trust, a project of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I like to keep our issues topical, and as we have an election coming up, I thought we'd take some time to talk about election integrity, as it's been an issue running all the way back to the 2020 election. Want to get a feeling for kind of a little bit of background, what happened, what led us up to the current state of where we are, what steps have been taken to ameliorate the issues as best we can, to allow states to be policy leaders on this initiative and understand their role in attributing both state and federal election law, as well as looking forward, what else needs to be done? What are the things that we need to advance both at the state and at the federal level to ensure that we continue to make progress on election integrity and point ourselves in the right direction? Joining us today for this discussion is Josh Findlay, Director of Election Protection Project at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Chris. Happy to be here.
Thank you. You've been working on this issue for a long time. You were the first ever National Director of Election Integrity for the Republican National Committee. You've dealt with this at the presidential campaign level, at the gubernatorial campaign level. As I said, can you kind of start us off by giving us a little bit of background on what led up to kind of this as a national issue that we're discussing still to this day, 5 years removed from the 2020 election?
Sure. Well, I've got to tell you, Chris, election integrity was not a national issue for Republicans or conservatives until roughly the 2020 election. And we all know what happened there. I say for conservatives because the liberal left, had been planning to weaponize election integrity, going all the way back to 2008 were the first books that they were writing on how to manipulate the election process for their benefit. From about 2008 until that 2020 election, conservatives just had confidence in the election process. They showed up and voted, assumed that their votes were being counted properly and that everything was on the up and up. In 2020, that did not happen, though, in the presidential election, right? We all remember under the guise of COVID, a lot of things changed. Some people say the election was stolen. I prefer to use the term rigged. And I think you can look at a couple of things. Like, you don't even have to get to stolen, right? You can look at a couple of things to show how the left manipulated that election to their benefit. The first was the unilateral changes they made to the election process. You saw just crazy ways of voting. You saw unmonitored drop boxes, 24-hour voting, drive-by voting, universal mail-in voting in jurisdictions that did not have the capacity to properly process that many ballots. In that election, the game changed from counting votes to counting ballots for the left. It was an exercise of generating as many ballots as possible and getting those ballots in boxes by any means necessary. Second thing was Zugbucks, the outside funding of elections. The left used $500 million of Mark Zuckerberg's dollars to turn local governments into partisan get-out-the-vote operations. And I say partisan because there have been lawsuits about this. In Racine County, Wisconsin, the judge ruled that their drive-by voting vans were improper because they were used for a partisan purpose. They were going to Democrat areas to pick up Democrat votes.
So these weren't just normal kind of get-out-the-vote operations.
No. These were funded, privately funded partisan get-out-the-vote operations with a government label on them, essentially. And then the last thing was just the inability of the courts to do anything during that election cycle. Even though there were all these questions about process, a lot of times you couldn't even get court hearings to talk about the merits of these cases, let alone any judgment as to whether things were right or wrong. And by the left controlling, that branch of government, they had an extreme advantage. And that changed everything for election integrity going forward. From there on, everybody knows now, unfortunately, that this is a process that can be used to weaponized for a political advantage.
Yeah, so you don't have to necessarily say that the election was stolen, but you also can't say it was the most secure election in United States history either, right? So you had to take a real close look at what was done in a very unusual circumstance to kind of figure out what those particular issues that we need to go forward, that we need to deal with. What are some of the issues that we have dealt with since that election?
Well, so the election integrity atmosphere is night and day different than it was in 2020. First thing is conservatives are paying attention to how elections are run now. And we are treating this as a full-time operation. There are groups like the Election Protection Project, TPPF. We are constantly watching what is happening in election boards, what the secretaries of state are doing, what voting companies are doing, and how they're affecting the election process. So I would say some of the big things that we've dealt with is there are 20-something states that have passed laws to outlaw those Zuck bucks that we were talking about earlier, the outside funding of elections. There are citizen initiatives that have been passed to improve voter ID laws and make it so that only citizens can vote. Changes are happening left and right, but it's a constant battle, and the target is always moving.
Can you give us a little breakdown on what the president's executive order that he did when he was early in ours, I believe it was in March, trying to get at this issue? What kinds of policy approaches does that executive order take?
Well, this executive order was tremendously important. And we've got to give all the credit in the world for President Trump and what he's doing on election integrity. A lot of people don't know this, but his White House counsels are election integrity lawyers. His general counsel is probably one of the best election integrity lawyers out there. And his deputy counsel is a former member of the Election Assistance Commission. And so he's got election integrity lawyers at the top of the White House. The great thing about these executive orders is they go to the heart of what people doubted about the election process in 2020. They have to do with voting machines, with voter ID, and it instructs the Election Assistance Commission to put a new certification standard in for voting machines. Truth of the matter is, regardless of what you think happened in the 2020 election, many voting machines have vulnerabilities. Whether they're used or not, that can be a matter of debate. That can be a matter of checking for evidence and all of that sort of thing. But these election machines have vulnerabilities. And I think what the president's trying to do is cut down on those vulnerabilities and eliminate the loopholes that could be used to manipulate the election process. The other thing is it has to do with voter ID. The Election Assistance Commission has a federal form that everybody can use, has to use, right? It's mandated by the court, that does not require proof of citizenship, which seems crazy, right? Like on this federal form, we just ask people we trust people, right? And I think it goes to making changes to that form as well to require proper voter ID. And then President Trump also made a statement about mail-in voting. We haven't gotten an executive order on that yet, but it is tremendously important. Mail-in voting is our weakest form of voting in this country. Maybe the most insidious thing that has lasted since 2020 is just the normalization of mail-in voting by people who don't need to. I think roughly a third of the country votes by mail. 1 in 3 people votes by mail these days. And we've got to tighten the loopholes that allow that insecure method of voting.
Okay. So a little bit of a kind of a federal policy change at the state level in the state of Georgia, which I believe you are from.
That's right.
There was a rather contentious law, maybe something that was akin to Jim Crow, as the former president liked to state. Can you tell us a little bit about what that initiative did, and why were people coloring it in a way that convinced the MLB to pull the All-Star game the year that was passed, and then also kind of how it's played out in real life?
Well, so this is SB 201. People called it Jim Crow 2.0. That's what the left called it. The biggest problem with this bill was that it illustrated the political nature of our elections. The election process should not be political. Essentially, it's a counting exercise. It's an accounting process between a person and their government, right? It is a transaction between two entities. We should be able to get that transaction right every single time. What SB 202 showed was that no matter what, the two sides are going to turn basic common sense changes into a political football. That's why the All-Star game pulled out. What it showed afterwards, though, was that voting actually increased among all of these populations that the left said was never going to be able to vote, that it was going to be too hard to get proper ID and all of this sort of thing. So there's statements about the effects of this bill were just false, right? Had nothing In fact, it had the opposite effect on voting in Georgia, right? Which is crazy. But the election process has just become a political football, and that's why we fight over issues like voter ID and only citizens voting that 80% of the country agrees on no matter what.
So we saw something that was supposed to suppress voter turnout actually help enable an increased turnout in the state of Georgia, from what I remember. All right. Yeah. So again, we've talked a little bit about where we were, things we've done to try to improve on that situation. What are some things looking forward that you would like to see done, either at the federal or the state level, to continue to make progress on this issue?
Well, I think the first thing is we've got to be very careful about too much federal intervention in our elections.
States Trust likes to hear that.
That's right. But there are some things that need to be fixed. The first thing for sure is that issue with the voter ID and citizenship voting that I talked about earlier. That rule came about because of the National Voting Rights Act. We've just got to close that loophole. We have to demand that only citizens vote and provide proof of citizenship in our elections. Other than that, my hope is that the federal government does a lot to stay out of our elections outside of, cleaning up things that they've already put in place. At the state level, though, there is a lot that needs to be done to clean up our elections. The first thing is we've got to require proper voter ID, right? At the state level, right? A lot of people don't know this, but you can get a driver's license and vote in most states without providing real proof of who you are or where you live. Second thing is we've got to clean up our voter rolls. There is just no excuse for the way that our voter rolls get bloated, the way that it takes so long to figure out where people live or if they've died. The truth of the matter is credit companies and banks know where you are all the time. They can figure that out right away. So the data's out there. Our voter rolls should apply that same information to figure it out. And then we've got to clean up the way that we process our ballots. California took 38 days to wrap up their last congressional race during the last election cycle. That is just way too long to be counting ballots.
Were they in session by the time they finished counting ballots at that? Yeah.
Just about. No, there were poor election workers that were working over Thanksgiving, right, to finish counting their ballots. And that's just too long. It leads to doubt and it leads to mistrust in the election process. So at the state level, there's a lot that needs to be done with our elections.
Are there any specific states that you can point to with regards to, say, the voter roll cleanup that have done, good work that other states can look at as policies to pursue or follow?
Yeah, states like Alabama and Mississippi have done a lot to clean non-citizens off of their voter rolls. This may be shocking, but I have to commend the Nevada Secretary of State. During the last election, he sent out a mailer to basically everybody on the voter rolls in Nevada. And if they didn't respond, they were moved to inactive status. And it ended up being like 111,000 people that were moved to inactive status. It shows that cleaning the voter rolls was probably long overdue. But congratulations to him for doing it. And states need to follow that model and clean the voter rolls more often.
Right. Is there anything that you're looking towards? Virginia and New Jersey specifically have upcoming elections in November. Is there anything that you're going to be looking for as far as how those elections play out? What things you're going to be trying to engage in to help make sure that there's integrity to those elections, that you've protected them, if you will?
Well, it's interesting. I think the New Jersey race might be tighter than a lot of people expect it to be. And with the way things are going in Virginia, there are some races on that ballot that are going to be pretty close as well. And I think there's going to be heavily contested legislative seats. So a couple of things that we're looking for in those races, both of them. First of all, making sure that the elections are being properly observed. Virginia has 45 days of early voting. 45 days. That is an absurd amount of time to be observing an election. But we need to make sure that people are observing the election process from start to finish. In New Jersey in the past, they've had trouble getting poll workers appointed. A couple of years ago, they had, and there's a very strong partisan requirement for Republican and Democrat poll workers in New Jersey. A couple of years ago, they didn't have enough Republican poll workers, so they had to bring in the National Guard to fill those Republican roles. So we're focused heavily on making sure that people are in place to observe all the parts of the election because there are the typical errors that happen, right? We're already seeing in Pennsylvania that duplicate votes, duplicate mail ballots were created for people and sent out. We just got to keep an eye to make sure that things like that don't happen. But then the other thing is, we're seeing a very disturbing trend in the liberal left not following the rule of law when it comes to elections this year. Right now in Michigan, the Secretary of State is defying a subpoena from the Republican state legislature about what kind of training materials she is providing to the county clerks. In Maine, we just did a podcast with a Republican state legislator the other day. Randomly 250 ballots were delivered by Amazon to just a citizen at her house. And the Republican Secretary of State is refusing to investigate that so far. I think it's shocking, but she's going to have to answer for that somehow. In Georgia right now, Fulton County Board of Commissioners is refusing to seat 2 members of the Board of Elections, conservative members of the Board of Elections, and is incurring a $10,000 a day contempt fine. Now, even more problematic is the Court of Appeals said they don't have to pay for it, even though it clearly violates state law. But the left is just refusing to follow the rule of law in so many cases right now, and we need to be aware of that.
Right. And I have to ask this question because you look at all these crazy things that happen in elections. What's the most bizarre thing you've ever seen with regards to an infringement on the integrity of election? What's the most ridiculous observation you've made?
Well, I'll tell you the most, there were a lot of these from 2020. But I think the most ridiculous thing that I've seen is Pennsylvania unilaterally put in mail-in voting, right? Not long before the election. And they did not have the capacity to process that many mail-in votes. So you look at the pictures of Bucks County, Pennsylvania, right? One of the bigger collar counties of Philadelphia. They just had mail-in votes stacked floor to ceiling out in the open that they were counting for weeks after the election because they didn't have the proper machines there.
No kind of secured location, no kind of
secure. Our presidential elections rested on those stacks of ballots being counted and processed properly. The same thing, you would see these drop boxes just out on the side of the road, cardboard boxes, sometimes with the lid askew, sometimes rain pouring down on it. And there was video of people ballot harvesting, putting multiple ballots in the box. But the courts just said, once the ballot's in there, we can't do anything to pull it out. Just crazy things. COVID was a weird time, right? There were a lot of things to be concerned about then. And if you have to change your voting methods, you have to provide a secure process. You have to increase transparency and security along with the access that people were providing.
So as a final question, kind of where we've been with regards to COVID and all of the things that have gone down, are you seeing an increase in people's trust of the process? Are we getting somewhere, do you think, where we can get public opinion to kind of coalesce around the idea of they can trust their elections? Because it seems to be a real concern, just ignoring all the online language that you see. There's, you'll talk to our neighbors and friends, and they're really still concerned about this issue. Are you seeing kind of an ability to be able to help people feel more comfortable with the process going forward, or are we still a long way away from that?
Absolutely. People, I think, are feeling more comfortable, and they should feel more comfortable. It's interesting. In the aftermath of the 2020 election, there was polling in Georgia that showed that almost 80% of Republicans thought the election was stolen. Almost 80% of Republicans in Arizona thought the election was stolen. And we know that's why they didn't show up and vote in that Senate race after 2020. So we've come a long way since then. I think the issue now is people generally trust the election process enough to show up and vote. But we've got to keep an eye on the stories, right? The way that the media covers this, they say nothing happened. There's nothing to see here. They say that because these election errors may not flip election results. But people know what they see. When they show up to vote in Maricopa County and lines are 2 hours long, people know that something is wrong with the election process. When they show up to vote in Harris County, Texas, and machines aren't working for whatever reason, or they've run out of paper or whatever it is, people know that something is wrong with the election process.
Or they're waiting over a month to actually get the results of the election. Yeah.
That's right. People see this and they're not being fooled anymore, right? So they know enough to be confident that they need to vote because that's the only way to win. But they also know that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And it's up to us to increase that trust and accountability in the election process. It's up to election administrators everywhere to ensure that people have trust in the process and therefore the results.
All right. Well, as you say, there's a lot of work to be done on this, and we greatly appreciate all the work that you've done on this. So, audience, please make sure that you follow what Josh has done. He's got his own podcast on election protection that he runs that I certainly encourage you to see, and then we'll put in the comments section below. But with that, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.